Robert Martinez stood on the wraparound porch of his great-grandfather's Victorian house, running his weathered hands along the original wooden railings that had been painted and repainted dozens of times over the past century. The morning sun cast long shadows across the meticulously maintained garden, where his grandmother had once grown prize-winning roses. This wasn't just any house, it was a piece of living history. Built in 1897 by his great-grandfather, who had been one of the first Mexican-American entrepreneurs to establish a successful business in the neighborhood, the house had weathered everything life could throw at it. 2 world wars, the Great Depression, economic booms and busts, and countless family celebrations and sorrows. Robert's grandfather had added the second story in the 1940s when the family business expanded. His father had modernized the kitchen and bathrooms in the 1970s, while carefully preserving the original hardwood floors, crown molding, and stained glass windows that made the house truly special. Robert had grown up in these rooms, sliding down the polished banister as a child, helping his mother cook traditional meals in the spacious kitchen, and listening to family stories told by 3 generations of Martinez men who had called this place home. When his father passed away 5 years earlier, Robert inherited not just a house but a legacy. He had spent thousands of dollars maintaining the property's historic character while ensuring it met modern safety standards. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the decades. What started as a diverse community of working families had gradually transformed into an upscale area where young professionals and affluent retirees competed for the limited housing stock. Property values had skyrocketed, and with them came new rules, new expectations, and eventually, a homeowners association that promised to protect property values and maintain community standards. Robert had initially been supportive of the HOA formation 3 years ago. He understood the desire to keep the neighborhood looking its best, and he took pride in his own property maintenance. His house was always the envy of neighbors. The lawn perfectly trimmed, the flower beds bursting with color, and the historic facade lovingly maintained with period-appropriate paint colors that he had researched extensively at the local historical society. The first signs of trouble came in small ways that Robert initially dismissed. A letter here and there questioning his choice of outdoor furniture. A complaint about the height of his hedges, even though they had been the same height for decades. Comments about his mailbox, which was an original cast-iron piece from the 1920s that his grandfather had installed. Robert responded to each complaint professionally, providing documentation about the house's historic status and explaining the reasoning behind his maintenance choices. The HOA board consisted of 5 members, led by a woman named Patricia Whitmore, who had moved into a newly constructed McMansion at the end of the street 2 years earlier. Patricia had made it clear from the beginning that she believed the neighborhood needed modernization and standardization. She frequently spoke at board meetings about property values and the importance of maintaining a cohesive aesthetic that would appeal to potential buyers. Robert attended several HOA meetings, always prepared with documentation and a respectful attitude. He explained the historical significance of his property and showed photographs of how the house had looked throughout its history. He brought letters from the local Historical Preservation Society supporting his maintenance approach. He even offered to give tours of the house to help his neighbors understand why certain features were worth preserving. Most of his neighbors were supportive, especially the longtime residents who remembered Robert's family and appreciated the house's unique character. The Johnson family next door had always admired the original landscaping. Mrs. Chen across the street often complimented Robert on how beautifully he maintained the property. Even some of the newer residents expressed appreciation for having such a well-preserved piece of history in their neighborhood. However, Patricia and her core group of supporters on the HOA board seemed unmoved by these arguments. They began issuing increasingly specific and demanding violation notices. The original shutters were the wrong shade of green. The front gate, hand-forged by a local blacksmith in 1902, didn't match the approved styles in the HOA handbook. The mature oak trees in his front yard needed to be trimmed to match the height restrictions that had been established for newer plantings. Each violation notice came with a fine and a deadline for compliance. Robert found himself spending hours researching regulations, attending board meetings, and corresponding with the HOA management company. The stress was beginning to affect his sleep and his health. His wife Maria watched with growing concern as the man she had married began to show signs of the pressure he was under. The breaking point came when Robert received a violation notice for his house's paint color. The deep burgundy with cream trim had been carefully selected to match the original 1897 color scheme, documented in photographs and paint samples that Robert had discovered in the house's basement. The Historical Preservation Society had not only approved the color choice but had featured Robert's house in their annual newsletter as an example of thoughtful, historic restoration. The HOA disagreed. According to their recently updated guidelines, all houses in the neighborhood were required to be painted in one of 12 approved color combinations, none of which included the historic burgundy and cream. Robert was given 30 days to repaint his entire house or face escalating fines that would eventually lead to legal action. Standing on his porch that morning, Robert realized he was facing a choice that would determine not just the future of his family's house, but the precedent for how the HOA would treat other longtime residents who didn't fit their vision of neighborhood conformity. He had always been a man who preferred negotiation to confrontation, but something about this latest demand felt like more than just a disagreement about paint colors. It felt like an attack on everything. His family had worked to build and preserve. Robert walked back into his house and sat down at the kitchen table, where 4 generations of Martinez men had made important family decisions. He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. If the HOA wanted a fight, he would give them one, but it would be fought with careful preparation, thorough research, and the kind of patient determination that had built his family's legacy in the first place. Robert spent the next week buried in research, transforming his dining room into a makeshift command center, filled with legal documents, historical records, and correspondence files. He had contacted 3 different attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes, and their advice was both encouraging and sobering. While he had strong grounds for challenging the HOA's demands, the legal process would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. The first attorney, Sarah Chen, explained that historic preservation laws could provide some protection, but they would need to establish formal historic designation for his property. This process could take months or even years, and in the meantime, the HOA's fines would continue to accumulate. The second attorney warned Robert that many HOA disputes dragged on for years, destroying relationships within the community and costing both sides far more than anyone anticipated. Robert's wife Maria found him at the dining room table at 2 a.m, surrounded by property deeds, photographs, and legal documents. She had been supportive but increasingly worried about the toll this battle was taking on her husband. They had been married for 28 years and she had never seen him so consumed by a problem. The Robert she knew was a problem solver who found practical solutions and moved on with his life. "Maybe we should just paint the house," Maria said softly, sitting down beside him. "It's just paint, Robert. We can change it back later when this all blows over." Robert looked up from the 1920s city planning documents he had been studying. "It's not about the paint anymore," he said. "If we give in on this, what's next? The shutters? The front gate? The oak trees? Where does it end, Maria? When do we stop being the Martinez family house and become just another generic property that looks like everything else on the street?" Maria understood her husband's passion, but she also saw the practical reality of their situation. Robert was 53 years old and ran a small accounting firm from his home office. They had 2 children in college and a mortgage that wouldn't be paid off for another 8 years. A prolonged legal battle could drain their savings and put their financial security at risk. The next morning brought a certified letter that made their decision more urgent. The HOA had filed a formal lien against their property for accumulated violation fees totaling $3,200. The letter explained that if the violations were not corrected within 30 days, the lien amount would increase to $5,000, and the HOA would begin legal proceedings that could ultimately result in the forced sale of the property to recover their costs. Robert stared at the legal document, feeling a cold anger settle in his stomach. A lien on his family's house. The house his great-grandfather had built with his own hands. The house that had sheltered 4 generations of his family through every challenge life had presented. The HOA was threatening to force the sale of his home over paint colors and hedge heights. He called the Historical Preservation Society and spoke with Margaret Thompson, the director who had worked with him on documenting his house's historic features. Margaret was outraged when she heard what was happening. She explained that Robert's house was exactly the kind of property that historic preservation laws were designed to protect. She offered to write letters supporting his position and to testify if the matter went to court. Margaret also suggested that Robert contact the local newspaper. "This isn't just about your house," she explained. "This is about whether communities can preserve their historic character in the face of aggressive standardization. People need to know what's happening." Robert was hesitant about involving the media. He had always been a private person who preferred to handle his problems quietly and directly. But as he looked around his dining room at all the evidence he had gathered, photographs showing his house in 1897, 1920, 1945, and today, all demonstrating the careful preservation of its original character, he realized that this story was bigger than his personal situation. The reporter who came to interview Robert was a young woman named Jessica Rodriguez who specialized in local government and community issues. She walked through the house with obvious appreciation, photographing the original hardwood floors, the hand-carved newel post, and the stained glass windows that Robert's grandfather had commissioned from a local artisan in 1925. "This is incredible," Jessica said, standing in the living room and looking up at the original tin ceiling tiles. "How many houses like this are left in the city?" "Not many," Robert admitted. "Most of them have been torn down or so heavily modified that they've lost their historic character. That's why this fight matters so much." Jessica spent 3 hours with Robert, taking notes and photographs and reviewing the correspondence between Robert and the HOA. She was particularly interested in the timeline of escalating demands and the seeming contradiction between the HOA's stated goal of maintaining property values and their insistence on eliminating the very features that made properties in the neighborhood historically valuable. The article appeared in the Sunday edition of the local newspaper under the headline "Historic Home Faces HOA Pressure to Conform." Jessica had done her homework, researching similar cases in other cities and interviewing experts about the tension between historic preservation and homeowners association rules. The article included a timeline of the dispute, photographs of Robert's house, and quotes from both Robert and Patricia Whitmore, the HOA board president. Patricia's comments revealed the fundamental disagreement at the heart of the conflict. "While we respect Mr. Martinez's attachment to his family home," she was quoted as saying, "the HOA has a responsibility to all residents to maintain consistent standards that protect everyone's property values. Individual preferences cannot override community rules that were established democratically by the membership." Robert's response was measured but firm. "This house is part of our neighborhood's history and character. Destroying that history in the name of conformity doesn't protect property values. It eliminates the very things that make our community special and desirable." The article generated immediate response from readers. The newspaper's website was flooded with comments, most of them supporting Robert's position. Several readers shared their own stories of HOA overreach, creating a broader conversation about the balance between community standards and individual property rights. More importantly, the article caught the attention of Amanda Foster, a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases involving discrimination and property rights. Amanda called Robert the day after the article appeared, explaining that she had handled similar cases where HOAs had targeted longtime residents whose properties didn't fit the aesthetic preferences of newer, more affluent neighbors. "I'd like to review your case," Amanda told Robert. "This looks like it might be more than just a disagreement about paint colors. There could be broader civil rights implications here that are worth exploring." Robert agreed to meet with Amanda, feeling for the first time since this ordeal began that he might have found an ally who truly understood what was at stake. Amanda Foster arrived at Robert's house on a crisp Tuesday morning, carrying a leather briefcase and a digital recorder. She was a woman in her early 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the Victorian's facade as she walked up the front path. She paused at the hand-forged gate that the HOA wanted removed, running her fingers along the intricate metalwork. 902, she asked, examining the maker's mark stamped into the iron. "You know metalwork?" Robert replied, impressed. "I know craftsmanship," Amanda said, "and I know when something irreplaceable is being threatened by bureaucratic nonsense." Inside the house, Amanda spent an hour reviewing Robert's documentation while asking detailed questions about the timeline of HOA demands. She was particularly interested in the composition of the HOA board and the voting patterns on various decisions affecting Robert's property. As she worked, she made notes in a small notebook, occasionally asking Robert to clarify dates or provide additional documentation. "Tell me about the other longtime residents," Amanda said. "Are you the only one who's been targeted with these kinds of demands?" Robert thought for a moment. "The Johnsons next door have gotten a few violation notices, but nothing like what I've received. Mrs. Chen was told to remove her traditional Chinese garden gate, but she complied rather than fight it. The Hernandez family down the street was told their front yard fruit trees were non-compliant, so they had them removed." Amanda made more notes. "I'm seeing a pattern here that concerns me. Can you show me the demographic breakdown of who's been cited for violations versus who's been left alone?" Over the next 2 hours, Robert and Amanda created a detailed map of the neighborhood, marking each property with information about the residents, their length of residence, and any HOA violations they had received. The pattern that emerged was troubling but clear. The residents who had received the most violation notices and the highest fines were predominantly longtime residents from minority backgrounds, while newer residents in recently built homes had received few or no citations despite obvious violations of their own. "Look at this," Amanda said, pointing to a house 3 doors down from Robert's. "They installed a 6-foot privacy fence last year without HOA approval, which is clearly prohibited in the guidelines you've shown me. No violation notice, but you get cited for having hedges that have been the same height for 30 years. Amanda explained that she had handled several cases where HOAs had been used as tools for demographic change, systematically targeting longtime residents with harassment and fines until they were forced to sell their properties. The legal term was constructive eviction, and it was often difficult to prove because the harassment was disguised as legitimate rule enforcement. The challenge, Amanda explained, is that HOAs have broad legal authority to enforce their rules. Even when those rules are applied selectively or unfairly, we need to build a case that shows a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that violates fair housing laws. Amanda's investigation expanded over the following weeks. She interviewed other residents who had been targeted by the HOA, collected public records about board meetings and voting patterns, and analyzed the demographic changes in the neighborhood over the past 5 years. What she discovered painted a disturbing picture of systematic targeting. The HOA had been formed just 3 years earlier, shortly after several longtime Hispanic and African American families had been forced to sell their properties due to financial difficulties during the economic downturn. The new buyers were predominantly young, affluent, and white. The HOA board elections had been held during weekday afternoon meetings that many working residents couldn't attend, resulting in a board dominated by retirees and people with flexible schedules. Patricia Whitmore had moved to the neighborhood specifically because of its potential for improvement, according to her own statements at early board meetings. She had campaigned for the HOA's formation by promising to standardize the neighborhood, aesthetic, and protect property values through consistent enforcement of community standards. The evidence Amanda gathered showed that the HOA's enforcement actions had disproportionately affected longtime residents from minority backgrounds. These residents were cited for violations at a rate nearly 4 times higher than newer residents, despite similar or identical property conditions. The violations were often for features that had existed for decades without previous complaints, such as Robert's historic paint colors and traditional landscaping. Meanwhile, newer residents routinely violated HOA rules without consequence. Amanda documented dozens of examples: unapproved satellite dishes, non-compliant fencing, prohibited business signs, and landscape modifications that clearly violated the same rules being strictly enforced against longtime residents. The pattern was so clear that Amanda felt confident about filing a federal civil rights complaint under the Fair Housing Act. She explained to Robert that this law prohibited discrimination in housing based on race, national origin, and other protected characteristics. Using HOA rules to systematically harass minority residents was a clear violation of federal law. However, Amanda warned Robert that federal civil rights cases moved slowly and attracted significant attention. "Once we file this complaint," she explained, "this stops being a private dispute between you and your HOA. This becomes a matter of public record that will likely attract media attention and could make you a target for retaliation. Robert discussed the decision with Maria, who had initially been hesitant about escalating the conflict, but had become increasingly angry as Amanda's investigation revealed the discriminatory pattern of HOA enforcement. "They're not just trying to make you paint your house," she told Robert. "They're trying to drive us out of our own neighborhood." The decision became easier when Robert received another certified letter from the HOA. The lien on his property had been increased to $5,000, and the association was moving forward with legal action that could result in foreclosure proceedings. The letter gave Robert 30 days to pay the accumulated fines and comply with all outstanding violations or face the possibility of losing his home. Robert called Amanda immediately. "File the complaint," he told her. "If they want to destroy everything my family has built here, they're going to have to explain their actions to a federal judge." Amanda filed the civil rights complaint on a Thursday morning in November, 3 months after the first lien notice had been placed on Robert's property. The complaint alleged that the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association had engaged in a pattern of discriminatory enforcement designed to force longtime minority residents from the neighborhood through systematic harassment and excessive fines. The complaint included detailed documentation of the enforcement disparities, demographic analysis of the targeted residents, and evidence that the HOA board had knowledge of the discriminatory impact of their actions. It sought damages for the Martinez family, an injunction preventing further discriminatory enforcement, and oversight of future HOA actions to ensure fair treatment of all residents. The filing immediately generated local media attention, with several news outlets picking up the story of the historic house and the family, fighting to preserve their neighborhood's character. The story resonated with readers who had their own experiences with aggressive HOAs and communities. Struggling to balance development pressure with historic preservation, Patricia Whitmore issued a statement through the HOA's attorney denying any discriminatory intent and claiming that all enforcement actions were based solely on objective rule violations. However, the public documentation of the enforcement disparities made this defense increasingly difficult to maintain. Robert knew that filing the federal complaint had escalated the conflict beyond anything he had originally imagined, but he also knew that he was no longer fighting just for his own house. He was fighting for the principle that longtime residents had the right to remain in their communities without facing harassment designed to force them out. The federal civil rights complaint sent shockwaves through the Meadowbrook neighborhood that extended far beyond Robert's expectations. Within 48 hours of Amanda filing the lawsuit, 3 television news stations had called requesting interviews, and a reporter from the state's largest newspaper wanted to do a follow-up story on what she called a case study in gentrification and housing discrimination. Robert found himself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. He had always been a private person who preferred to handle problems quietly, but now his front yard was occasionally filled with reporters, cameras, and curious neighbors. Some longtime residents approached him with encouragement and their own stories of HOA harassment. Others seemed nervous about being associated with someone who was challenging the system they had accepted as inevitable. The HOA's response was swift and aggressive. They hired Thornton, Marshall & Associates, a law firm that specialized in defending homeowners associations against discrimination claims. Within a week, Robert received a thick envelope containing a counter-lawsuit alleging that he had damaged property values through his refusal to comply with community standards and had defamed the HOA board through his public statements to the media. Amanda reviewed the counter-lawsuit with Robert and Maria in their living room, explaining that it was a common tactic designed to intimidate plaintiffs and drain their resources through expensive legal proceedings. "They're hoping you'll get scared and settle," she explained. "But this actually strengthens our case because it shows they're more interested in silencing you than addressing the legitimate issues we've raised." The counter-lawsuit claimed $50,000 in damages and asked for an injunction, requiring Robert to immediately comply with all HOA demands or face additional penalties. It painted Robert as a stubborn resident who was selfishly damaging the community through his refusal to follow rules that everyone else accepted. Reading the legal documents, Robert felt a familiar anger building in his chest. The HOA attorneys had characterized his great-grandfather's Victorian house as a non-conforming eyesore, and described his efforts to preserve historic features as obstinate, refusal to participate in community improvement. They had reduced 4 generations of his family's investment in the neighborhood to a legal inconvenience that needed to be eliminated. The media attention brought unexpected allies. Dr. Sarah Martinez, no relation to Robert, a professor of urban planning at the State University, called to offer her expertise as an expert witness. She had researched the use of HOAs as tools for demographic change and had testified in similar cases across the country. What's happening in your neighborhood is part of a national pattern, Dr. Martinez explained during their phone conversation. HOAs have become one of the primary mechanisms for excluding longtime residents from rapidly gentrifying communities. The discrimination is usually hidden behind seemingly neutral rules, but the impact is very clear when you look at the data. Dr. Martinez offered to conduct a formal analysis of the Meadowbrook HOA's enforcement patterns, comparing them to demographic data and property values over time. Her research would either support or refute Amanda's theory that the HOA was systematically targeting minority residents for removal from the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the practical pressures on Robert's family continued to mount. The legal fees were already approaching $15,000, and Amanda warned that the case could drag on for 2 years or more. Robert's accounting business was suffering because he was spending so much time dealing with lawyers, media interviews, and document preparation. Maria had started working extra hours at her job to help cover the increasing expenses. The stress was beginning to show in other ways. Robert had difficulty sleeping and found himself constantly checking the mail for new legal documents. Maria worried about her husband's health and their financial stability. Their college-age children called more frequently, concerned about the news coverage they were seeing and the impact on their family. 3 weeks after the federal complaint was filed, Robert received an unexpected phone call from James Morrison, a real estate developer who had been quietly buying properties in the neighborhood over the past 2 years. Morrison asked if he could meet with Robert privately to discuss a mutually beneficial solution to the HOA dispute. Morrison arrived at Robert's house driving a Tesla and wearing an expensive suit that seemed designed to emphasize his success. He was a man in his early 50s with carefully styled silver hair and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted through negotiation rather than confrontation. "I'll be direct with you, Mr. Martinez," Morrison said, settling into Robert's living room furniture. "I represent a group of investors who are very interested in this neighborhood's development potential. We've been acquiring properties with the goal of creating a cohesive high-end residential community." Morrison explained that his investors had been working with the HOA to establish standards that would attract affluent buyers and support premium property values. Robert's house, while historically significant, didn't fit the aesthetic vision they were trying to create for the neighborhood's future. However, Morrison continued, "We recognize the value of what you've built here, and we're prepared to make you an offer that reflects both the property's current value and the inconvenience you've experienced." Morrison's offer was $480,000 for Robert's house, nearly $100,000 above its assessed value, and enough to pay off the mortgage and legal expenses, while leaving the family with a substantial profit. In exchange, Robert would drop the federal lawsuit and agree to a confidentiality clause preventing him from discussing the HOA dispute publicly. "You could buy a beautiful house in any neighborhood you wanted," Morrison said, "somewhere without all this conflict and legal complexity. Somewhere you could enjoy your retirement without fighting bureaucratic battles." Robert listened to the offer politely, but felt his anger growing with every word. Morrison was essentially confirming everything Amanda had suspected about the HOA's true purpose. This wasn't about community standards or property maintenance. It was about systematically removing longtime residents to make way for a development project. "Let me ask you something," Robert said when Morrison finished his presentation. "How many other families have you made similar offers to?" Morrison smiled. "I'm not at liberty to discuss other negotiations, but I can say that most people have found our offers very attractive when they consider all the factors involved." After Morrison left, Robert called Amanda immediately to report the conversation. Amanda was not surprised by the developer's involvement, but she was excited about the evidence it provided for their case. "This is exactly what we needed," Amanda explained. a direct connection between the HOA's enforcement actions and a commercial development scheme. Morrison just handed us proof that this discrimination isn't incidental. It's part of a coordinated plan. Amanda advised Robert to document everything about Morrison's visit and offer while the details were fresh in his memory. She also suggested that Robert consider wearing a recording device if Morrison contacted him again, which would be legal under the state's recording laws as long as one party to the conversation consented. Robert discussed Morrison's offer with Maria that evening. The money would solve their immediate problems and allow them to start fresh somewhere else, without the stress and uncertainty of a federal lawsuit. They could buy a house in a different neighborhood and put this entire ordeal behind them. But as they talked, both Robert and Maria kept coming back to the same fundamental question. If they accepted Morrison's offer and walked away, what would happen to the other longtime residents who were facing similar pressure? What would happen to the neighborhood's historic character and the community that their families had helped build? If we take the money and run, Maria said, we're basically validating everything they've done. We're telling them that harassment works and that longtime residents can be bought out if the price is right. Robert looked around his living room at the photographs of 4 generations of his family who had called this house home. He thought about his great-grandfather who had built the house with his own hands, his grandfather who had expanded it during the post-war boom, and his father who had lovingly maintained its historic character while adapting it for modern life. We're not selling, Robert told Maria. Whatever it costs us, we're going to fight this thing all the way to the end. Robert's decision to reject Morrison's buyout offer marked a turning point in the case that neither he nor Amanda had anticipated. Within days of Morrison learning about Robert's refusal, the HOA's legal tactics became significantly more aggressive. They filed additional violation notices for infractions that seemed increasingly petty and vindictive. The height of Robert's mailbox post, the spacing of his porch railings, and the non-standard font used on his house numbers. Each new violation came with escalating fines and shortened deadlines for compliance. The HOA also began conducting daily inspections of Robert's property, with board members and their representatives walking slowly past his house, taking photographs and making notes on clipboards. The psychological pressure was intense and clearly designed to make Robert's daily life as uncomfortable as possible. Amanda documented each new violation and harassment incident, building a case that the HOA's actions had shifted from discriminatory enforcement to outright retaliation. Federal civil rights laws provided strong protection against retaliation for filing discrimination complaints, and the HOA's behavior was creating a clear paper trail of vindictive harassment. The situation escalated further when Patricia Whitmore organized what she called a community standards meeting at the neighborhood elementary school. The meeting was ostensibly designed to discuss property maintenance and community rules. But the real agenda became clear when Whitmore spent most of her presentation discussing the challenges created by residents who refused to follow established guidelines. Robert attended the meeting with Maria and Amanda, sitting in the back of the cafeteria, while Whitmore displayed photographs of violation properties on a portable screen. Robert's house appeared repeatedly in the presentation, with close-up shots of his historic shutters, traditional landscaping, and period-appropriate paint colors. Whitmore described these features as inconsistent with community standards and detrimental to neighborhood property values. The presentation reached its climax when Whitmore displayed a computer-generated image showing what Robert's house would look like if it were brought into compliance with HOA standards. The Victorians' distinctive burgundy and cream paint scheme had been replaced with generic beige. The original shutters were gone, and the hand-forged gate had been replaced with a standard aluminum model. The mature oak trees in the front yard had been removed, and the traditional flower gardens had been replaced with basic foundation plantings. As you can see, Whitmore told the audience, compliance with our standards would create a much more cohesive and attractive streetscape that benefits everyone in our community. Robert felt physically sick looking at the digitally altered image of his family's house. The computer rendering showed a property that had been stripped of every feature that made it historically significant and architecturally distinctive. It looked like a generic suburban house that could have been built anywhere in the past 20 years. Several longtime residents in the audience shifted uncomfortably during Whitmore's Presentation. Mrs. Johnson, Robert's next-door neighbor, raised her hand to ask why. The HOA was focusing so intensively on houses that had been maintained beautifully for decades while ignoring obvious violations by newer residents. Whitmore's response was carefully rehearsed. The board addresses violations based on complaints received and the severity of non-compliance. We don't target any particular properties or residents. We simply respond to community concerns about maintaining our established standards. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Robert privately to express their support and concern about the HOA's increasingly aggressive tactics. Carlos Hernandez, whose fruit trees had been removed under HOA pressure, apologized for not supporting Robert earlier. "I thought if I complied quietly they would leave me alone," he said. "But I see now that they won't be satisfied until all of us original residents are gone." The community meeting had an unexpected consequence that worked in Robert's favor. Several local news outlets covered the event, and the computer-generated image of Robert's compliant house became a powerful symbol of the conflict between historic preservation and aggressive standardization. The image was shared widely on social media, generating hundreds of comments from people who saw it as an example of HOA overreach. Dr. Martinez completed her analysis of the Meadowbrook HOA's enforcement patterns and presented her findings to Amanda in a detailed report that would serve as expert testimony. Her research confirmed that the enforcement disparities were statistically significant and followed clear demographic lines. Longtime minority residents were being cited for violations at rates that could not be explained by random enforcement or genuine rule violations. The report also revealed that property values in the neighborhood had actually declined slightly since the HOA's formation, contradicting Whitmore's claims that aggressive enforcement was protecting everyone's investment. Properties with historic character were commanding higher prices than generic renovated houses, suggesting that the HOA's standardization efforts were actually damaging the neighborhood's economic appeal. Amanda used Dr. Martinez's findings to file an amended complaint that included additional charges of retaliation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The amended complaint also requested punitive damages and attorney fees, significantly raising the stakes for the HOA and their legal team. The HOA's attorney, Richard Thornton, requested a meeting with Amanda to discuss possible settlement options. The meeting took place in a downtown conference room with polished wood tables and floor-to-ceiling windows that seemed designed to intimidate. Thornton was accompanied by Patricia Whitmore and 2 other HOA board members, while Amanda brought Robert and her legal assistant. Thornton opened the meeting by acknowledging that the situation had become unnecessarily adversarial and suggesting that both sides had legitimate interests that could be accommodated through compromise. He proposed that Robert be allowed to maintain his current paint, colors, and landscaping in exchange for making specified modifications to his shutters and front gate. The proposed compromise would have required Robert to remove the original hand-forged gate and replace it with a historically inspired reproduction that met current HOA guidelines. He would also need to modify his shutters to match approved dimensions and hanging hardware specifications. Robert listened to the proposal with growing frustration. The compromise would require him to destroy irreplaceable historic features and replace them with generic reproductions that looked similar but had none of the authentic character or craftsmanship of the originals. "You're asking me to tear down a gate that was made by a master craftsman in 1902, Robert said. "That gate is a work of art that represents the neighborhood's authentic history. You want me to replace it with something mass-produced in China so it can match your approved styles list?" Whitmore responded that the HOA had to balance individual preferences with community standards. "We can't make exceptions for every resident who wants to maintain non-conforming features," she said. "If we allow Mr. Martinez to keep his original gate, then everyone will want special treatment for their personal preferences." Amanda interrupted Whitmore's explanation. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you familiar with the National Historic Preservation Act and the protections it provides for historically significant properties?" The question seemed to catch Whitmore off guard. She looked to Thornton for guidance before responding. "We're not trying to destroy history," she said. "We're simply trying to maintain consistent standards that protect everyone's property values." Amanda pulled out a folder containing correspondence from the State Historic Preservation Office. 2 weeks earlier, She had contacted the State Preservation Office and requested an official evaluation of Robert's property. The state had responded with a letter confirming that the Martinez house met the criteria for historic designation and recommending that it be added to the National Register of Historic Places. Mr. Martinez's property has been determined eligible for National Register designation, Amanda explained. This means that any alterations to its historic features could violate federal preservation laws, regardless of local HOA rules. The news clearly surprised Thornton and his clients. They had assumed that HOA covenants would override any historic preservation concerns, but federal law actually provided significant protection for historically significant properties. If Robert's house was formally added to the National Register, the HOA would be legally prohibited from requiring changes to its historic features. The settlement meeting ended without agreement, but Amanda could see that the legal landscape had shifted in Robert's favor. The HOA was no longer dealing with a simple property dispute that they could resolve through aggressive enforcement. They were now facing a federal civil rights case involving a property that had been officially recognized as historically significant. Over the following weeks, the HOA's position continued to deteriorate as Amanda's investigation uncovered additional evidence of discriminatory enforcement and developer involvement. She obtained records showing that Morrison's development company had been consulting with the HOA board for over a year, providing community planning expertise that coincidentally aligned with their property acquisition goals. Email records obtained through legal discovery revealed that Patricia Whitmore had been in regular contact with Morrison's company, discussing strategies for improving neighborhood composition and encouraging voluntary property transfers. The emails made it clear that the HOA's enforcement actions were part of a coordinated effort to pressure longtime residents into selling their properties. The most damaging evidence came from a recorded phone conversation between Whitmore and another board member that had been inadvertently included in a voicemail message. In the recording, Whitmore could be heard saying, "If we keep the pressure on Martinez and a few of the other holdouts, Morrison thinks we can clear out most of the old-timers within 2 years. The key is making their lives miserable enough that they'll take his buyout offers." When Amanda played the recording for Robert and Maria, they sat in stunned silence. The casual way Whitmore discussed driving longtime residents from their homes was shocking, even though they had suspected the HOA's true motives for months. "She's talking about us like we're problems to be solved," Maria said quietly. "Like our family's 40-year investment in this neighborhood means nothing." The recording provided the smoking gun that Amanda needed to prove intentional discrimination and conspiracy. Combined with the pattern of selective enforcement, the developer connections, and the retaliation evidence, the case against the HOA had become overwhelming. Robert looked at the legal documents spread across his dining room table and realized that they had moved far beyond his original goal of simply being left alone to maintain his family's house. The case had become a landmark battle over the rights of longtime residents to remain in their communities without facing harassment designed to force them out. The next phase of the legal battle would determine not just the fate of Robert's house, but the precedent for how communities across the country balance development pressure with the rights of existing residents. Robert knew that the outcome would affect thousands of families facing similar pressures in rapidly changing neighborhoods. The revelation of Patricia Whitmore's recorded conversation created a media firestorm that extended far beyond the local community. National news outlets picked up the story as an example of HOA overreach and discriminatory housing practices, with Robert's Victorian house becoming a symbol of the struggle between historic preservation and aggressive development. Cable news programs featured debates between urban planning experts and property rights advocates, using Robert's case to discuss broader issues of gentrification and community displacement. The story resonated with viewers across the country who had their own experiences with overzealous homeowners, associations, and communities struggling to balance growth with character preservation. The increased media attention brought both benefits and challenges for Robert's case. Donations poured in from supporters across the country who wanted to help with legal expenses, allowing Robert and Maria to continue fighting without facing financial ruin. Historic preservation organizations offered expert testimony and research support, strengthening the legal case significantly. However, The national attention also attracted criticism from property rights groups who argued that HOA rules should be enforced consistently regardless of individual circumstances. Some commentators suggested that Robert was using discrimination claims to avoid following rules that other residents accepted without complaint. The HOA hired a public relations firm to manage their image crisis, issuing statements that portrayed the board as reasonable community volunteers who were being unfairly attacked for trying to maintain neighborhood standards. They emphasized that all residents had agreed to follow HOA rules when they purchased their properties, and that selective enforcement would undermine the entire system of community governance. Patricia Whitmore gave several television interviews where she attempted to explain her recorded comments as being taken out of context. She claimed that her reference to clearing out old-timers was simply about encouraging voluntary property sales to residents who might be happier in communities without HOA rules, not about forcing anyone from their homes. The explanation satisfied few observers, particularly when Amanda released additional email evidence showing that Whitmore had received consulting payments from Morrison's development company for community relations work. The payments totaled over $25,000 over 18 months, creating an obvious financial conflict of interest that Whitmore had never disclosed to HOA members. Dr. Martinez's research attracted attention from housing policy experts, who began studying the Meadowbrook case as part of broader research into HOA discrimination patterns. Her findings were cited in academic papers and policy reports, establishing Robert's case as an important precedent for understanding how homeowners associations could be used as tools for demographic change. The legal discovery process continued to reveal damaging evidence about the HOA's true motivations and methods. Internal board meeting minutes showed that members had discussed strategies for encouraging property turnover and attracting more suitable residents to the neighborhood. These discussions had taken place during closed executive sessions that were not open to community members. Amanda also uncovered evidence that the HOA had selectively enforced rules based on residents' ability to fight back legally. Elderly residents and families with limited English proficiency had been targeted with the most aggressive enforcement actions, while residents with obvious resources and legal knowledge had been largely left alone. The pattern was so clear that Amanda felt confident about expanding the case to include class action claims on behalf of all affected residents. She filed a motion to certify a class that would include any Meadowbrook resident who had been subjected to discriminatory enforcement or harassment by the HOA. The class certification hearing took place in federal court on a cold January morning, with Robert and Maria sitting in the gallery behind Amanda's table. Judge Catherine Williams, a respected jurist with extensive experience in civil rights cases, listened carefully to arguments from both sides before asking pointed questions about the evidence of systematic discrimination. Thornton, the HOA's attorney, argued that the enforcement disparities were coincidental and that each violation had been addressed based on its individual merits. He claimed that Robert's case was unique and not representative of any broader pattern of discrimination. Amanda responded by presenting statistical analysis showing that the enforcement disparities were far too significant to be explained by coincidence. She also played portions of Whitmore's recorded conversation and presented evidence of the financial relationships between board members and Morrison's development company. Judge Williams seemed particularly interested in the evidence of developer involvement and the systematic nature of the enforcement disparities. She asked detailed questions about the timeline of violations and the criteria used by the HOA to determine which properties required enforcement action. After 2 hours of arguments and testimony, Judge Williams announced that she would issue a written ruling within 30 days. However, her questions during the hearing suggested that she was inclined to certify the class and allow the case to proceed to trial. While waiting for the judge's decision, Robert received another surprise visit from James Morrison. This time, the developer arrived with a much larger entourage, including 2 attorneys and a financial consultant. Morrison's demeanor was noticeably less friendly than during his previous visit. "Mr. Martinez," Morrison said, settling into Robert's living room with obvious irritation. "This situation has gotten completely out of hand. What started as a simple property dispute has become a circus that's damaging everyone involved." Morrison's new offer was substantially larger than his previous proposal. He was now prepared to pay $650,000 for Robert's house, nearly double its assessed value, in exchange for dropping all legal claims and agreeing to an expanded confidentiality agreement that would prevent Robert from discussing the case publicly for 10 years. "This is more money than you could possibly get from a lawsuit," Morrison explained. "Even if you win everything you're asking for, the legal fees and years of litigation will consume most of any damages you might receive. This offer gives you immediate financial security and allows you to move on with your life." Morrison also made thinly veiled threats about the consequences of continuing the legal battle. He mentioned that his company had significant resources and could afford to litigate for years if necessary. He suggested that the stress and publicity were taking a toll on Robert's family and business that might not be worth the principal involved. Robert listened to Morrison's presentation with growing anger, particularly when the developer began discussing the impact on Robert's children and grandchildren. Morrison seemed to be suggesting that Robert was being selfish by putting his family through the stress and uncertainty of a prolonged legal battle. "Let me ask you something," Robert said when Morrison finished his pitch. "How many other families have you driven out of neighborhoods with these tactics? How many communities have you destroyed by systematically removing longtime residents who didn't fit your development plans?" Morrison's facade of reasonableness slipped slightly. "Mr. Martinez, I'm a businessman who develops properties that people want to buy. I don't force anyone to sell their homes. I simply make offers that most people find attractive when they consider all the factors involved, including harassment campaigns run by corrupt HOA boards that you're secretly paying," Robert replied. Morrison stood up abruptly, clearly angry that Robert had mentioned the board payments that had been revealed during discovery. "That's a serious accusation that you'll need to prove in court," he said. "I hope you're prepared for the consequences of making false statements about my business practices." After Morrison left, Robert called Amanda to report the conversation and the escalated buyout offer. Amanda was encouraged by the developer's obvious desperation and the size of the offer, which suggested that Morrison was seriously concerned about the potential outcome of the case. "The fact that he's offering so much money shows that he knows we have a strong case," Amanda explained. "If he thought he could win in court, he wouldn't be trying so hard to buy you out." Amanda also noted that Morrison's threats about prolonged litigation could potentially be used as evidence of intimidation and retaliation, further strengthening their position. She advised Robert to document everything about the meeting while the details were fresh in his memory. Judge Williams issued her ruling on the class certification motion 3 weeks later, granting the request and allowing the case to proceed as a class action, representing all Meadowbrook residents who had been subjected to discriminatory enforcement. The ruling found that there was sufficient evidence of systematic discrimination to warrant class treatment and that individual lawsuits would be inefficient for addressing the widespread violations of federal housing law. The class certification ruling transformed Robert's individual property dispute into a major civil rights case that would determine the rights of longtime residents in HOA communities across the country. The stakes had grown far beyond anyone's original expectations, and both sides began preparing for a trial that would establish important legal precedents for housing discrimination and community governance. The trial of Martinez versus Meadowbrook Homeowners Association began on a humid Monday morning in July, nearly 2 years after Robert had received his first violation notice for his historic paint colors. The federal courthouse was packed with media representatives, civil rights advocates, and residents from communities across the region who were facing similar conflicts with their own homeowners associations. Robert sat at the plaintiff's table wearing his best suit, the same one he had worn to his father's funeral and his daughter's college graduation. Maria sat directly behind him in the gallery, along with several neighbors who had joined the class action. The weight of representing so many families and communities facing similar struggles felt enormous. As Robert looked around the courtroom, Judge Williams had assembled a jury of 8 people who would decide whether the Meadowbrook HOA had violated federal housing laws through discriminatory enforcement and retaliation. The jury included a retired teacher, a small business owner, an engineer, and several other community members who would evaluate the evidence and determine the outcome of this landmark case. Amanda's opening statement laid out the evidence methodically, using charts and photographs to show the pattern of discriminatory enforcement that had targeted longtime minority residents while ignoring similar violations by newer, more affluent neighbors. She presented the case as a textbook example of how homeowners associations could be used as tools for demographic change and community displacement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Amanda said, "this case is about whether longtime residents have the right to remain in their communities without facing harassment designed to force them out. The evidence will show that the defendants engaged in a systematic campaign to drive the Martinez family and other longtime residents from their homes, not to enforce legitimate community standards, but to clear the way for a profitable development scheme." Thornton's opening statement for the defense attempted to reframe the case as a simple property dispute between a stubborn homeowner and a community association trying to maintain reasonable standards. He argued that Robert had agreed to follow HOA rules when he moved to the neighborhood and had no right to claim special treatment because of his family's history with the property. "The defendants are volunteers who donated their time to maintain community standards that protect everyone's property values," Thornton told the jury. "Mr. Martinez received the same enforcement treatment as any other resident who violated established rules. His claims of discrimination are an attempt to avoid following the same community standards that his neighbors accept without complaint." The first week of testimony focused on establishing the timeline of HOA enforcement actions and the demographic patterns of residents who had been targeted with violations. Dr. Martinez presented her statistical analysis, showing that longtime minority residents had been cited for violations at rates that could not be explained by random enforcement or legitimate rule differences. The expert testimony was compelling, but the most powerful evidence came from the HOA's own records. Amanda presented hundreds of emails, meeting minutes, and financial documents that showed the coordination between board members and Morrison's development company. The paper trail revealed a deliberate strategy to pressure longtime residents into selling their properties through systematic harassment and escalating fines. Patricia Whitmore's testimony was the dramatic centerpiece of the second week. Under direct examination by Thornton, she maintained that all enforcement actions had been based on legitimate rule violations and community complaints. She denied any discriminatory intent and claimed that her comments about clearing out old-timers had been misunderstood. However, Whitmore's composure cracked during Amanda's cross-examination. When confronted with her consulting payments from Morrison's company, she struggled to explain why she had never disclosed the obvious conflict of interest to HOA members. When asked about specific enforcement decisions, she couldn't explain why obvious violations by newer residents had been ignored while minor infractions by longtime residents had resulted in substantial fines. The most damaging moment came when Amanda played the full recording of Whitmore's conversation about making longtime residents' lives miserable enough to accept buyout offers. Whitmore's attempt to claim that her words had been taken out of context was unconvincing when the jury heard the complete conversation in her own voice. James Morrison was subpoenaed to testify about his company's involvement with the HOA and his attempts to acquire properties in the neighborhood. Under oath, he was forced to admit that his development company had been consulting with the HOA board for over a year and had made buyout offers to several longtime residents who were facing aggressive enforcement actions. Morrison attempted to characterize his involvement as legitimate business activity, but Amanda's questioning revealed the coordinated nature of the pressure campaign. The timeline showed that residents received their most severe violation notices shortly after refusing Morrison's initial buyout offers, creating a clear pattern of escalating harassment designed to force property sales. The defense's case relied heavily on character. Witnesses who testified about the HOA board's good intentions and community service. Several newer residents praised the board's efforts to maintain neighborhood standards and claimed that property values had improved since the HOA's formation. However, this testimony was undermined by Amanda's presentation of actual property value data, showing that homes with historic character were commanding higher prices than generic renovated properties. The neighborhood's appeal to buyers was actually enhanced by its diverse architectural heritage, not damaged by it. The jury also heard testimony from longtime residents who described the impact of the HOA's harassment campaign on their families and their sense of community belonging. Carlos Hernandez testified about being forced to remove his fruit trees, while Mrs. Chen described the pressure she had faced to eliminate traditional elements of her garden design. Robert's own testimony came near the end of the trial. He spoke quietly but passionately about his family's four-generation investment in the neighborhood and their efforts to preserve the historic character that made the community unique and valuable. He described the impact of 2 years of legal battles on his family's health, finances, and sense of security in their own home. "This house isn't just where I live," Robert told the jury. "It's where my great-grandfather built a life for his family when Mexican Americans weren't welcome in most neighborhoods. It's where my grandfather expanded the business that employed dozens of people from our community. It's where my father taught me that taking care of your property and your neighbors was a responsibility that came with home ownership." Robert's voice became stronger as he continued. "The HOA wants to eliminate everything that makes this house special and historic. They want to turn it into another generic property that looks like it was built last year. But this house tells the story of our neighborhood and our community. If we let them destroy that history, we're not just damaging one family. We're erasing the heritage that makes this place worth preserving." The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman announced that they had found in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts. The HOA had violated federal housing laws through discriminatory enforcement, retaliation, and conspiracy, with a developer to systematically remove longtime minority residents from the neighborhood. The jury awarded $150,000 in compensatory damages to Robert's family and $50,000 to each of the other class members who had been subjected to discriminatory enforcement. More importantly, they awarded $2.5 million in punitive damages designed to deter similar conduct by other homeowners associations. Judge Williams also issued a comprehensive injunction that prohibited the HOA from enforcing any rules against historic properties without approval from a court-appointed monitor. The injunction required the HOA to revise their enforcement procedures to eliminate discriminatory practices and to provide fair treatment for all residents regardless of their background or length of residence. The verdict sent shockwaves through the HOA industry and established important legal precedents for protecting longtime residents from discriminatory harassment. Legal experts predicted that the case would be cited in similar disputes across the country and would force homeowners associations to reconsider aggressive enforcement tactics that disproportionately affected minority residents. For Robert and Maria, the victory meant more than financial compensation. They had successfully defended their right to maintain their family's historic home and had established protections for other families facing similar pressure. The legal battle had cost them nearly 3 years of stress and uncertainty, but they had preserved their heritage and created precedents that would benefit communities across the country. 6 months after the trial, Robert stood on his front porch looking at the hand-forged gate that the HOA had once demanded he remove. The gate remained exactly as his grandfather had installed it in 1902, a symbol of craftsmanship and heritage that had survived not just the passage of time, but a deliberate attempt to erase it in the name of conformity. The neighborhood had changed again since the trial. Several board members, including Patricia Whitmore, had resigned in disgrace. Morrison's development company had abandoned their acquisition plans and moved to other markets. New residents moving into the neighborhood were attracted by its historic character and diversity, rather than despite these features. Robert's Victorian house remained a centerpiece of the community, its burgundy and cream paint scheme now protected by federal law as a historically significant feature. The mature oak trees continued to shade the front yard, and the traditional gardens bloomed each spring just as they had for over a century. The fight had been difficult and expensive, but it had also been necessary. Robert had learned that some principles were worth defending regardless of the cost, and that ordinary people could successfully challenge powerful interests when they were willing to stand up for what was right. His family's house remained a home, a heritage site, and a symbol of the ongoing struggle to preserve community character in a rapidly changing world.